In March of 2009, a group of investors bought an entire Formula One team for £1. Not £1 million, not 100,000. One single British pound, about the same price as a chocolate bar at a service station. 8 months later, that team won the World Championship. Both of them, actually, the driver's title and the constructor's title, in its very first season of existence. No team before or since has pulled that off on debut. And the company that gave the team away, the one that had spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to win exactly that championship, was Honda. A company that had already dominated this sport once before, so completely that rival engineers stopped trying to out-engineer them and just waited for Honda to leave instead. 23 years before that £1 sale, Honda's engines were so far ahead of everyone else's that beating them wasn't really considered realistic. It was something you hoped for. Honda's relationship with Formula One goes back further than most people realize, all the way to 1964, when the company built its own car and its own engine and turned up to a Grand Prix as a full manufacturer, just 4 years after it had built its first road car. An American driver named Ronnie Bucknam took that first Honda onto the grid in Germany and finished 13th. It wasn't glamorous, but it proved Honda could build a Formula One engine from nothing, and that stubborn, do-it-ourselves instinct never really left the company, even decades later when doing it themselves was the exact thing pushing them toward bankruptcy on this same grid. Honda pulled out at the end of the 1960s, came back briefly, pulled out again, and then in the mid-1980s made the move that actually built its legend. Instead of running its own team, Honda decided to supply engines to other people's cars. It powered Williams, starting in 1984, and the partnership clicked almost immediately. By 1986, the turbocharged Honda V6 was so strong that the Williams FW11 was considered one of the most powerful cars of the entire season. Honda missed the driver's title that year by 2 points. It didn't miss again for a long time. In 1987, Honda powered both Williams and Lotus, and Nelson Piquet delivered the Drivers' Championship that Soichiro Honda had reportedly wanted ever since the company first turned up in 1964 with a car nobody expected to finish, let alone win anything. Honda took the constructor's title that year too. Then it moved to McLaren, and what happened next is still talked about as one of the most dominant stretches in the sport's history. Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna, driving Honda-powered McLarens, won 15 of the 16 races on the 1988 calendar. 15 out of 16. Between 1988 and 1991, McLaren Honda won 4 consecutive constructors' titles and 4 consecutive drivers' titles. Senna won all 3 of his world championships with a Honda engine behind him, and when he re-signed with McLaren for 1992, he made a point of crediting that partnership directly, describing a level of respect for the people building his engines that went well beyond a normal supplier relationship. Add it all up, and between 1988 and 1992, Honda-powered cars won 44 of 80 Grand Prix, more than half of every race run in Formula One during that stretch. 6 Constructors' Championships across the Williams, Lotus, and McLaren era combined. This is the Honda that existed in the collective memory of the sport for the next 2 decades. Not a struggling manufacturer looking for a buyer, the gold standard every other engine builder was measured against. Then, in 1992, in the middle of a serious downturn back home in Japan, the company walked away from Formula One again, mid-dominance, simply because the balance sheet stopped justifying the spending. It's worth remembering that detail, because it wasn't the last time money, rather than performance, would decide Honda's fate in this sport. It wouldn't be the last time either. Honda spent most of the 1990s out of the picture, but the itch never fully went away. In 1998, the company announced it wanted back in, and there was even serious talk of returning as a full constructor building its own chassis again. That plan got shelved after the sudden death of the engineer leading it, Harvey Postlethwaite, in 1999. So Honda came back the safer, slower way instead, as an engine supplier again, joining the British-American racing team, known throughout the paddock simply as BAR, for the 2000 season. It was a much slower rebuild this time around. Honda supplied Jordan alongside BAR for a couple of seasons in the early 2000s, then narrowed its focus down to BAR alone from 2003 onward. A young British driver named Jenson Button had joined that BAR project in 2003, after an early career that had already put him through more turbulence than most drivers see in a decade. Button made his Formula One debut all the way back in 2000 with Williams, finishing 8th in the championship as a rookie. He moved to Benetton the following year, which was rebranded Renault the year after that, then switched to BAR in 2003, where he finished 3rd in the Drivers' Championship in 2004, BAR's best result yet as a team. There was even a messy contractual tangle around that period, a dispute serious enough that a contract recognition board had to formally rule on which team Button was actually allowed to drive for the following season. The board ruled he had to stay at BAR Honda. He did, and when Honda bought the team outright at the end of 2005, Button simply stayed put, buying his own way out of a competing contract with Williams to do it. So in 2006, Honda did something it hadn't done in over a decade. It stopped being just an engine supplier and bought BAR outright, turning it into a full Honda Works team, running its own name on the car for the first time since the sport's earliest years. Same ambition as the 80s. Own the car, own the engine, own the result. And for one afternoon in Hungary in 2006, it looked like it might actually work out that way again. Button, still without a single Grand Prix win to his name after more than 100 race starts, took his Honda to victory in the rain at the Hungaroring. It was his 113th race start, his first win, Honda's first win as a full constructor since the golden years, 2 decades earlier. For a moment, the story writing itself looked like the beginning of a return to form, not a strange, isolated peak in an otherwise disappointing project. It was the isolated peak. That Hungarian win in 2006 turned out to be the highlight of the entire era, not the start of one. The 2007 season brought a car wrapped in an unmistakable green and blue Earth livery, tied to a new environmental messaging push the company called Earth Dreams. It got plenty of attention for the paint job, genuinely one of the more talked about liveries of the era. It did not get any attention for lap times. The car was slow and inconsistent, nowhere near the front of the grid all season, and by the end of 2007, Honda brought in its own championship-winning former technical director, Ross Brawn, as team principal for the following year, specifically to fix what had gone wrong. Brawn wasn't a stranger to turning teams around under pressure. He'd been technical director at Benetton in the early 1990s, helping build Michael Schumacher's first 2 world championships, and then spent nearly a decade at Ferrari from 1997 through 2006, one of the key architects behind Schumacher's extraordinary run there. If anyone in the sport could drag Honda's works team back toward competitiveness, the paddock figured, it was him. Braun's own arrival at Honda is a small story in itself. Through most of 2006, there were persistent rumors in the paddock that he might join Red Bull instead, partly as a way of helping that team attract Fernando Alonso as a driver. None of that happened. Braun joined Honda for 2007, and years later, Button would describe the team's entire survival, bluntly, as something that simply would not have existed without him. But 2008 brought 2 separate problems at once, landing on top of each other, and only one of them was inside anyone's control to fix. The first problem was the car itself. It was uncompetitive from the opening race of the season, and by the summer, Braun made a decision that looked genuinely reckless at the time, the kind of call that could end a career if it went wrong. Rather than keep chasing incremental improvements on a car that was never going to be a winner, he told the team to abandon development of the 2008 car completely, mid-season, and pour every available resource into the car for 2009 instead, built under a completely new set of technical regulations that hadn't even been finalized yet. It was a bet that the new rules would offer a rare, narrow window to leapfrog every established team if Honda built the smartest possible interpretation of them before anyone else fully understood what those interpretations even were. The second problem had nothing to do with racing at all. Honda had already lost its main sponsor, the tobacco brand Lucky Strike, after advertising bans forced it off the car in 2007, taking a significant chunk of funding with it. Then, in September of 2008, the collapse of Lehman Brothers set off a global financial crisis that hit the automotive industry harder than almost any other sector on Earth. Honda was reportedly spending somewhere between $200 million and $300 million a year on a Formula One team that wasn't winning anything. At the exact moment its core road car business was bleeding cash everywhere else in the world, from Detroit to Tokyo. Executives back in Japan didn't wait around to see whether Braun's gamble on the 2009 rules would pay off. On December 5, 2008, with barely any warning to the people actually working the project, Honda announced it was pulling out of Formula One immediately. Not at the end of the following season, not after a wind-down period. Immediately. 700 people worked at the team's factory in Brackley, England, a site with genuine motorsport history running through it, its lineage tracing all the way back to Tyrrell in the late 1950s. Almost every one of those 700 people was suddenly days away from losing their job, right before Christmas, with a half-built car sitting in the workshop that Honda had already spent months and millions developing for a season the company was no longer going to compete in. For a company that had once been the most feared name in the paddock, walking away from Formula One this way, mid-project, mid-gamble, with a factory full of people about to lose their livelihoods right before the holidays, was about as far from the golden era as it was possible to get. The team that had powered Senna to 3 world championships was now facing straightforward liquidation, sold off in pieces, or shut down entirely, unless somebody stepped in fast enough to save it. Ross Brawn and the team's chief executive, Nick Fry, weren't ready to let that happen without a fight. And what the two of them were quietly holding on to, while nearly everyone else in the paddock assumed the story was already over, was that half-finished car built for 2009, and the head start buried inside it. Here's what almost nobody outside the factory understood in December of 2008. While every other team on the grid had spent the second half of 2008 fighting for points with their current aging cars, Honda's engineers had already stopped doing that months earlier. Braun's decision back in the summer to abandon the old car and pour everything into next year's regulations meant Honda's design team had a genuine head start on the biggest rules overhaul the sport had seen in years. A head start no other team on the grid had, because no other team had made that same painful call to give up on their current season early. It was, in Braun's own later description of the situation, not a dead team he was looking at, it was a sleeping one. Braun and Fry took an idea to Honda. Rather than liquidate the operation outright, let a management buyout take it off the company's hands. Honda would still have to write off its entire investment either way, but it wouldn't be the company remembered for firing 700 people 2 weeks before Christmas, and it wouldn't be stuck holding a factory and a workforce it no longer wanted anything to do with. There was also a colder, more practical argument sitting underneath the emotional one, and it's the argument that likely tipped the decision. Simply shutting the operation down and paying out the redundancies in full would have cost Honda somewhere in the region of £100 million anyway, once every contract, every severance package, and every winding down cost was accounted for. A sale, even one that made the company literally no money at all, was still cheaper than a closure. So Honda agreed. On March 6, 2009, the deal was finalized. The purchase price for the team, its factory, its staff, its equipment, and its half-built 2009 car was £1. Braun personally took a 54% ownership stake in the new operation, with the rest split among his fellow investors, who in turn took on every outstanding debt and liability the old team carried with it. On March 17th, the FIA formally approved the name change from Honda Racing F1 Team to Braun GP. Technically, under the sport's own rules, Braun GP was treated as a completely new entrant rather than a continuation of the old Honda operation, which should have meant a standard entry fee on top of everything else Braun was already scrambling to pay for. The FIA chose to waive that fee entirely, a quiet acknowledgement from the sport's own governing body of just how unusual the circumstances behind this particular entry actually were. They had 20 days before the first race of the season. 20 days to rebrand a factory that had spent a decade wearing Honda's name on every wall and every piece of equipment. 20 days to solve a problem that had nothing to do with aerodynamics or downforce. Honda's withdrawal meant Braun's brand new team had no manufacturer engine supplier anymore, and building an entirely new power unit from scratch in 3 weeks simply wasn't something any team on Earth could do. The team scrambled to secure a customer engine supply deal with Mercedes instead, and by most accounts it came together only weeks, in some tellings barely days, before the season opener. Reports from the period describe a team that couldn't even afford a full, proper pre-season test session at Silverstone, patching together whatever running time its skeleton budget could stretch to. This was not, by any reasonable measure, the picture of a championship contender. This was a team that shouldn't have been on the grid at all in 2009, let alone competitive, let alone about to dominate the opening third of the season. When Button himself finally got into the finished car at the last official test before the season, at Barcelona, his own race engineer told him afterward that his first flying lap had been 0.6 of a second faster than anything anyone else had managed across the entire test. Button's response, by his own account, was simply to ask for the setup to be tightened further, to see what the car could really do once it stopped fighting him through the corners. But the car underneath all that chaos carried something the rest of the grid hadn't spotted yet, and it had been sitting there, unfinished but full of promise, since months before the sale ever happened. Formula One's technical regulations changed dramatically for 2009, aimed squarely at cutting downforce and making overtaking easier by shrinking the size of the rear diffuser, the sculpted section under the back of the car that pulls air out from underneath it and generates grip. Honda's aerodynamicist, Sanayuki Minagawa, was reading through the new rulebook in his second language during an aerodynamics meeting when he spotted something the other team's engineers appeared to have read straight past. The regulations, as written, still left room to build a second diffuser channel higher up, fed through gaps built into the car's crash structure. It effectively doubled the volume of low-pressure air the diffuser could pull from underneath the car, which meant significantly more downforce, without technically breaking a single line of the new rules as they were actually written. Before committing engineering resources to it, the team checked directly with the FIA's technical delegate, Charlie Whiting, showing him early sketches of the concept before anything was built. According to the aerodynamicist directly involved, he looked over the simple drawings and said he didn't see any obvious reason it wouldn't be legal. So Honda's engineers, and then Braun's engineers after the buyout, built the entire 2009 car around that answer. It turned out Honda and Braun weren't the only ones who had found the loophole. Toyota and Williams had independently arrived at broadly similar double diffuser designs of their own, a coincidence widely attributed to shared engineering staff moving between Honda, its junior partner team Super Aguri, which had folded partway through 2008 and released a pool of experienced personnel back into the paddock, and its rivals. 3 teams turned up to the first race of 2009 with a piece of aerodynamic engineering nobody else on the grid had built, simply because nobody else had read that particular gap in the rulebook the same way, or had been willing to commit real resources to it this early. On March 29, 2009, in Melbourne, Braun GP lined up for its first ever Grand Prix under its new name. Jenson Button took pole position. He went on to win the race outright, with teammate Rubens Barrichello, a driver who had been racing in Formula One since 1993, without ever once winning a world championship of his own, finishing second, giving the brand new team a 1-2 finish on its debut weekend. It was the first time since Mercedes-Benz at the 1954 French Grand Prix that a constructor had taken pole position and then gone on to win the race on its very first outing in the sport. A team that had legally existed for 3 weeks, wearing a name most of the paddock hadn't heard before that season, had just beaten every established manufacturer on the grid on its first attempt. Rival teams noticed immediately, and they were not happy about it. Before the Australian Grand Prix weekend was even fully over, an official protest was filed against the diffuser designs on the Braun, the Toyota, and the Williams, arguing the concept broke the spirit of the new rules even if it didn't technically break the letter of them. Race stewards reviewed the cars in detail and rejected the protest outright. Renault, Ferrari, Red Bull, and BMW Sauber weren't satisfied with that answer and pushed the matter all the way up to the FIA's International Court of Appeal, with a hearing scheduled in Paris. Here's the detail that made the whole controversy almost beside the point by the time it was finally resolved. The appeal wasn't heard and settled until after the 4th round of the season, in Bahrain. By then, Brawn GP had already won 3 of the first 4 Grand Prix of the year, with the legality of its own car still formally under dispute. When the ruling finally came down in April of 2009, the court declared the double diffusers on all 3 cars completely legal under the existing regulations. Every other team on the grid now had to scramble to design and build their own version from scratch, mid-season, chasing a car and a concept that already had a several race head start on the entire field. There's a footnote to this that even most Formula One fans don't know. Years later, members of Brawn's own aerodynamics department said publicly that the double diffuser, for all the noise generated around it, was worth roughly 0.3 of a second a lap on that opening car in Melbourne. Not nothing, in a sport where races are won and lost by hundredths of a second, but not the sole reason for the win either. The bigger advantage, the one that never generated a single newspaper headline, was simply time. Honda's mid-2008 decision to abandon a lost cause of a car and throw every resource at the following year's rules had given the team months of design work that its rivals hadn't even started until much later in the year. The double diffuser became the story everyone told afterward because it was the story anyone could see and photograph. The head start was the story that actually mattered, and almost nobody outside the factory walls understood it at the time. Whatever the real split between clever engineering and a genuine time advantage, the results on track were not in dispute. Button won the season opener in Melbourne. He won again the following weekend in Malaysia. He won again in China. By the 4th round in Bahrain, with the legal fight over his own car's legality still completely unresolved, he had already won 3 of the 4 races run that season. It's worth sitting with that for a second. A team assembled from scratch in 3 weeks, running on borrowed engines, funded by a company that had just walked away from the entire sport, was lapping the field. Button's run continued into the 5th round in Spain, and then the 6th round delivered one of the more human, almost comic moments of his career. At the Monaco Grand Prix, one of the most prestigious races on the calendar, Button won again, and in the celebration afterward, he realized he had genuinely forgotten where he had parked his own road car earlier that day. He ended up jogging through the paddock, still in his race suit, trying to track it down before making his way up to greet dignitaries in the royal box. It is a small, slightly chaotic detail, but it captures something honest about that stretch of the season. Nobody on that team, Button included, had fully absorbed yet that they were living through a genuine, historic championship run, not just a lucky opening month. By the time the 7th round arrived in Turkey, Button had won 6 of the first 7 races of the entire year, 3 of them from pole position, accounting for more than a third of the whole 17 race calendar's worth of victories, already banked, with 10 rounds still left to run. It genuinely looked, from the outside, like the title race might already be over before summer had properly started. And then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, the dominance began to fade. This is where the story stops being a straightforward underdog fairy tale and turns into something more honest, and honestly more interesting. Brawn GP didn't run away with the title from that point on. It very nearly threw it away. Red Bull Racing, powered by Renault engines and fielding a young German driver named Sebastian Vettel alongside Australian driver Mark Webber, had spent the opening rounds of the season adapting to the new regulations without a double diffuser of their own. Once the FIA's ruling forced every remaining team to build one, and once Red Bull's own design department caught up with the concept, the gap that Brawn had opened back in Melbourne started closing fast, race by race. Vettel and Webber began taking wins and podiums that had gone almost exclusively to the 2 Brawn drivers earlier in the year. Ferrari and McLaren, both of whom had missed the double diffuser loophole entirely at the start of the season and were forced to redesign major sections of their cars mid-year just to stay relevant, slowly began clawing their way back into genuine contention too. Button did not win another race after Turkey. Not one, for the entire rest of the season. His form dipped noticeably through the middle rounds, and his qualifying performances in particular became a real, visible problem, while his own teammate Barrichello started winning races that Button himself hadn't managed to close out, taking a maiden victory of the season at the European Grand Prix in Valencia later in the year. What had looked like a comfortable procession toward the title back in June had turned, by August and September, into a genuinely stressful fight, with Button watching a commanding points lead shrink race by race, while Vettel, Webber, and Barrichello all hunted him down from behind. Across the season, Vettel, Barrichello, and Webber combined for 8 more race wins between them, finishing 2nd, 3rd, and 4th in the final championship standings, right behind Button. This is the part of the story that tends to get flattened in the retelling. It's easy, looking back more than a decade later, to describe 2009 as the year the miracle team from nowhere simply cruised to glory. It wasn't that. It was a team that built an enormous early advantage through a head start almost nobody else in the sport had, watched that advantage erode in real time as the rest of the grid caught up, and then had to hold its nerve through a genuinely difficult back half of the season just to close the job out. Button has said as much himself, in interviews long after the fact, pushing back directly on the idea that 2009 was some kind of effortless fairy tale season. By his own account, it was one of the hardest years of his entire career, not the easiest one. The championship came down, in the end, to the penultimate round of the year, the Brazilian Grand Prix at Interlagos, in mid-October. Button needed a strong result there to wrap up the title before the final race of the season in Abu Dhabi, and the weekend did not start well for him at all. Qualifying was run in genuinely difficult wet conditions, and Button had a poor session by his own standards, ending up down in 14th position on the grid, nowhere near good enough to comfortably seal a world championship the following afternoon. What happened on race day is the part of this story Brawn GP fans still talk about more than anything else. Button drove one of the best races of his career from that 14th place starting spot, working his way forward through the field lap by lap in tricky, constantly changing conditions, picking off cars one at a time with a patience that had nothing to do with the raw speed advantage the team had enjoyed back in March, and crossed the line in 5th place. It was enough. Combined with the results of the drivers ahead of him, 5th place at Interlagos was exactly enough points to clinch the 2009 Formula One World Drivers' Championship, with one full race weekend still left on the calendar. In that same race, Brawn GP secured the Constructors' Championship as well, making it, and this is the detail that still sounds almost unbelievable said out loud, the first team in the entire history of Formula One to win the Constructors' Championship in its debut season. Because Brawn GP existed for exactly one calendar year before being sold on to new owners, it holds a strange, permanent record that can now never be broken. It is the only team in the sport's history to win 100% of the world championships it was ever eligible to compete for. Every single title it entered, it won. Jenson Button had gone from standing at an airport baggage carousel in December of 2008, being told over the phone that his team no longer technically existed, to standing on a podium in Brazil 11 months later as world champion of the sport. Rubens Barrichello, his teammate, had been racing in Formula One since 1993 and had never won a title of his own in 16 years of trying, and came within one late-season swing of results of doing exactly that in this strange, improvised half-season that Honda never got to finish and never got to claim. Barrichello's story sits right alongside Button's, quieter, but just as remarkable in its own way. He had made his Formula One debut back in 1993, spent years at Ferrari as Michael Schumacher's teammate during the very era Ross Brawn helped build, and had watched Schumacher take championship after championship from the other side of the garage without ever landing one himself. 2009 was, by a wide margin, the closest he ever came, and he came within a handful of points of doing it in a car built by a company that no longer existed under the name on its own nose cone. None of it happened by accident, and none of it happened without real cost to the people living through it. Button took a pay cut just to stay with the team through the uncertainty of the buyout, with no guarantee any of it would work out. The mechanics and engineers who kept Brawn GP running through those first frantic 20 days worked with a fraction of the resources a normal, fully funded Formula One team would have had access to. And the whole extraordinary run was built, ultimately, on the back of a car Honda had already designed and already paid for, and then walked away from entirely. At the exact moment, its own gamble on the 2009 regulations was finally about to pay off for somebody else. The story doesn't end at the podium in Brazil. It ends in a way that closes the loop almost too neatly to be believable, with another sale. Barely a month after the season finished, speculation began swirling through the paddock that Brawn GP itself was for sale again, this time with a very different price tag attached to it. Mercedes-Benz, the manufacturer that had supplied the customer engines powering the championship-winning car all season long, agreed to buy the team ahead of the 2010 season. Reports at the time put the value of that deal at somewhere around £110 million, an almost unbelievable jump from the £1 Brawn and his partners had paid less than a year earlier. Brawn and his fellow investors, who had personally taken on every one of the team's outstanding debts and liabilities as part of the original buyout, walked away with a genuine fortune from a business almost nobody in the sport believed had any real value at all when they first agreed to take it on. Some later estimates put Brawn's own personal return from the sale and the season's results at somewhere around £100 million on an initial investment of a single coin. The team that Honda built and then gave away for nothing, and that Brawn briefly turned into world champions, became Mercedes GP for the 2010 season, and later evolved into the operation fans now know as Mercedes-AMG Petronas. Ross Brawn stayed on through the transition, helping steer the team through its early years under Mercedes ownership, laying groundwork that would eventually welcome Michael Schumacher back to a Formula One grid, and not long after that, a young British driver named Lewis Hamilton. From 2014 through 2021, that same operation, built on the bones and the factory and the staff of the team Honda, sold for £1, won 8 consecutive Constructors' Championships in a row, one of the most dominant runs the modern sport has ever produced. Honda, for its part, didn't disappear from Formula One forever either. The company returned as an engine supplier in 2015, first with McLaren and later with Red Bull, eventually helping power a young Dutch driver named Max Verstappen to world championships of his own in the 2020s. But the door Honda walked through in December of 2008, in the middle of a global financial crisis, giving up on a team it had spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars building, is the one that quietly reshaped the next decade and a half of the sport in ways nobody at Honda could have planned for or wanted. The double diffuser insight its own engineers found by reading the rulebook more carefully than anyone else on the grid. The head start its designers built by abandoning a lost cause early, while every other team kept fighting for points with a car that was never going to matter. The factory, the staff, and the half-finished car it eventually handed over for the price of a chocolate bar, because that was still cheaper than closing the door properly. None of that was Honda's plan. Honda's plan, going back to 1964, had always been to win championships with its own name on the car, using its own engine, built and run its own way. It did exactly that, spectacularly, across the 1980s and into the early 90s, with Senna and Prost and Piquet carrying Honda power to 6 constructors' titles across 3 different chassis partners. It tried to do it again with its own full works operation in the 2000s, and for one strange, chaotic season under a name it no longer owned, it finally succeeded, just not in any way anyone at Honda headquarters would ever have chosen for themselves. The team Honda built for less money than it would have cost the company to shut it down properly, went on to win every single championship it was ever entered for, then sold for over £100 million within a year, then spent the better part of a decade afterward as one of the most dominant operations Formula One has ever produced. Sometimes the biggest wins in this sport don't come from the manufacturer with the biggest budget or the longest history. They come from whoever is still standing and still building in the one narrow window when everybody else has already decided the story is over.